Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Lieutenant General Retired Terry Wolf, one of AUSA's Land Warfare Fellows. Thanks for joining us today. You're obviously here for panel number 7. There it is. I'm not going to talk any more about it, but merely to say that it is really it's shaped up to be a great panel, I think, and a good number of my old friends here are going to work this panel for you and hopefully provide an interesting perspective on this unique topic. AUSA does a lot of these sorts of things. This is about establishing forums like this. It's to broaden the knowledge of the greater community. You are the greater community. And it's to help with this base of knowledge for Army professionals and for those who support the Army. And there are a good number of you who were either in the Army or are Army followers or are Army groupies. So we really thank you all for being here today. This is the third day of the annual meeting, and the effort here is to continue to amplify the Army's narrative to audiences inside the Army and to help further the association's mission. And that mission is really pretty simple. It's to be the voice for the Army and support for the soldier. Can I have folks raise your hands if you're a member of AUSA? Okay, a good number of you are. If you aren't, you should feel guilty. All right, it isn't very hard. Please help us, because what AUSA tries to offer is advocacy. You've heard this paid political announcement before, but the advocacy that AUSA tries to offer is not only with the Army, but it's with Congress, it's with the Department, the Pentagon, the Defense Industrial Base, and certainly the populace and communities across the land. So thank you for those that are members of AUSA. If you are considering, it isn't very hard. You can go down to booth 307 in Exhibit Hall A. You can sign up online. That's probably easier and faster. So thanks for what you're doing to support AUSA. Thank you for being here today. This is a great panel. I'd like to turn the floor over to Lieutenant General Joe Anderson. Joe, to you, please.
Thanks, Terry. All right, good morning, all, and thanks for joining us this morning on this important topic. What I'm going to do is give you a quick overview on where we are in all things interoperability and where we think we're headed. Can I get the first slide, please? What you've got up there, of course, is how we define interoperability, which I think for the last couple of years we've actually had some challenges trying to figure it out. But it is our ability to achieve effective, expeditionary, uninterrupted mission command with designated unified action partners across a full range of military operations. And that is done through a human, procedural, and technological means, and we're going to cover each of those here in a minute. Paul will kick off with an operational overview just coming out of Iraq to show you the current interoperability challenges and context there. The human dimension addresses human-based activities that develop and support shared understanding and mutual trust with our partners, which are fundamental to developing purpose, unity of effort, and reduction of friction. And Catherine will talk about that here in a few minutes. The procedural dimension addresses processes and procedures that support and organize activities amongst our unified partners to minimize confusion and misunderstanding. Nick will cover that after Paul gets done. And then finally, the technical dimension, which addresses the establishment, operation, and maintenance of the network hardware, services, and applications that support the exchange of data and information between our unified action partners through the communication information systems. That's the sexy part of Mission Command. So that one we left to Doug. Yeah, right? So he can have that one. That's right. Exactly. Okay, what you'll see up there are 4 categories. So a lot of work this past year to try to figure out how we, define the problem, which I just did to you. Then how do you categorize what you're trying to achieve with your mission partners? And that's everything from are you trying to achieve operability because you want to fight together in support of an O-plan, or are you working things like special missions across the globe? Then you'll see up there 4 levels of interoperability of how we score based on how we feel we can work with our partners, everything ranging from not interoperable at all to fully integrated. So nirvana to back to nothing. And then we established the 4 priority areas. Back a year and a half, 2 years ago, when we had all of our different staff talks and counterpart visits, we as nations to nations couldn't figure out what we were trying to achieve. What were the priorities when you talk about interoperability? From simple things from a data, voice, PLI, FMV type perspective. But here you'll see communication information systems, you'll see ISR, you'll see digital fires, and sustainment. So that's kind of how we rack and stack them and focus our efforts, so we're not trying to solve everything. We're trying to focus and have a way forward based on what we think the greatest gaps are, principally in support of war plans. You'll also see 2 other documents up there kind of on the side. The first one was co-signed by Bob Ashley, then G2, and myself back in August of 17. And that was talking about something that Paul and I were just talking about in the break room over there. It's improving information sharing with our allies and partner nations, something that seems simple, but trying to get people just to understand the value of what it means to write for release, to make sure what you're putting on a piece of paper is easily accessible to pass off to Nick and Catherine sitting next to me over here. The second one is the Army Strategic Guidance for Interoperability, and interoperability remains a line of effort in the Army campaign plan. That document attempts to internalize and show the focus and the priority to make sure that we're aligned with the Secretary of Defense's priority of strengthening our allied and partner nation relationships. And we penciled that out here about a month ago. So a couple good foundational documents to move forward. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what's going on? The key here, I believe, is pinning the rows and making sure we've got a way ahead to move forward. And I think the first thing we did here very recently was the unified action component being signed out to our Combined Arms Center at Leavenworth to have somebody to be in charge. And the role of that for them is to execute force management responsibilities, which is concepts development, capabilities, determination, and capabilities integration relative to DOTML-PF for that particular function. We have prioritized and nested exercises as you follow on down that help us focus on how we execute interoperability. And these exercises identify training objectives to measure and test our interoperability objectives. So the things that were prioritized on the first slide, how do we make sure we can have better outputs? The most recent success was the joint warfare exercise that we had in Europe here this past spring, which was a huge interoperability and enabling our allied networks to contribute to a common operating picture that they could trust. They could all see the same thing, they could believe it, and allowed us to work the common operating picture. It totaled 167 contributing organizations. It had 25 training partners and 137 stakeholders. It afforded an excellent opportunity for our Army, the joint team, and our key strategic partners to develop an enduring mutual trust and shared understanding and enhanced our ability to fight and win in the battlefield. And again, that's focused on a peer, near-peer competitor. What you'll see next now is the Warfighter 18-4 coming up. Just occurred this past spring, was a huge success down at Fort Bragg. It tied the 3rd UK Division with the 18th Airborne Corps to again achieve a compatible, that term on the first slide, level of interoperability. And it demonstrated that both nations were capable of maneuvering, conducting limited fires, and employing common services to an exercise environment. And the key now, as we look at dynamic front, swift response, and all the things that we do around the globe, is how do you make sure they are nested and each of them feeds the next event. So both JWA 18-1 and Warfighter 18-4 are going to feed the next line you see there is Warfighter 19-4. And that's going to also focus on the mission partner environment. And it will also replace the Mission Command Information System, which is the links that have the network tied to CITAWARE, to the command post computing environment, which is an independent standalone capability. So a huge step forward. Pacific Pathways keeps being the exercise that allows us to hop around the Pacific to build readiness with all different participating nations, like our Australian friends. It's also where we're testing the multi-domain operations, and we're doing the multi-domain task force pilot with 17th Fires Brigade. So that will continue to help us in that environment. I think the huge success there this past summer was RIMPAC, which is where the MTF exercised future joint capabilities to demonstrate surface-to-ship missile capabilities and to sink a ship through the Link 16 multi-domain network. That was a huge step forward. That will continue to provide and inform those multi-domain efforts, which is the panel happening next door, as we move to Europe and look at 41st Fires Brigade and do a very similar thing there. And Defender 20 will be, think Reforger-like. That will be a big Reforger-like exercise coming summer of 20 for Europe, and that will be a very huge exercise. I think right now 20 participating nations, a huge deal, and again, all the same type of objectives to work our forces forward. Okay, and the multinational fusion cell is next, and that is where we're putting our Five Eyes plus Germany, South Korea, and Japan, and DAMO SS to be a full-time core team to be working interoperability nation to nation from a bilateral perspective, but also from a regional and global perspective as we prepare, again, for existing war plans. We will keep leveraging ADCANs, and the question becomes as we work with two of our partners up here is how does that become the standard bearer, the informer, the metric provider to evaluate how people are doing in each of those objective areas identified a little while ago. Okay, and last, please. And it all boils down to the way ahead, and again, I think it kind of speaks for itself, but again, it's how do we keep working all things policy to ensure people understand where we're trying to go? How do we operationalize this? That's every day from all events we do, be them exercises, home station training, combat training centers, all the like. And then how do we evaluate all these existing engagements and make sure from, again, a nested, prioritized, where everything can't be spread equally based on the focus for what the priorities are, how do we make sure we evaluate the existing efforts to ensure that we're putting our money where our mouth is. So that's kind of the way ahead here through again, the campaign plan to get there. So that's kind of the big overview of what we've taken a look at. And now I'll pass to you for real-world application.
Okay, so my name is Funk, and I'm a Phantom Warrior. This is my great opportunity to sit here today, and I'd like to thank AUSA for having this panel, because I see, and then you'll see on the slide that I just put up, which is the only slide I have, it is the end state. This is why interoperability matters. You see those young girls that are sitting there in the middle in the bright colored dresses? A day before that, they would have had to been in black. That's the day Raqqa was liberated. And those are the dresses they wore to celebrate the fact that they could now, in fact, move around freely. So that is the centerpiece of what I would say interoperability means. It means applying the resources of our great nations. And I had the distinct pleasure of being the Combined Joint Task Force commander most recently, just back about 3 weeks now. And 77 nations, 5 organizations, all rallied around a common, very simple mission statement: defeat ISIS. And when you think about that, why does interoperability matter to that? It is because as you bring those nations together and you focus the energy of good versus evil, good will prevail as long as we don't block ourselves with policies, procedures, and standards that don't make any sense. So I'll take you through a strategic and a couple of operational examples, and then some tactical approaches on why we are doing what we're doing. So let me just paint you the picture for context. If you look around the slides and the pictures there, you see a bunch of kids celebrating their army. This is the By, With, and Through campaign. So they are celebrating the return of honor to their nation. You see some Kurd forces and the federal police forces carrying a wounded Kurdish guy down a mountainside after he was wounded. That wouldn't have happened a year ago. But because we were able to interoperate, we used policies, plans, procedures that allowed them to come back together. And we as nations, because this is delivered, most of the training and most of the partnering is delivered across all of our great coalition partners. This was delivered because these guys decided to support one another. You can see Felix Gedney there, the Joint Task Force Deputy Commander for Strategy and Logistics, moving across in Mosul. Notice he's walking with a bunch of his Iraqi partners there, and he's not wearing any kit. That is trust, which is the basis behind what interoperability is all about. It is about trust. It's about finding the way to get to yes, to give the information to the guy or gal on the ground that's got to make it happen. And then you move over and you see training together. If you go on the other side of that, you see the guy, the mortar team being trained there. You see that down there at the bottom. I'm actually bottom, as you look at it, left-hand corner, I'm actually embarrassed to say that's me sitting downtown in Baghdad eating ice cream with my Iraqi partners. That's the kind of trust we have. That's what interoperability is all about. And that's why we've got to train together. The American flag vehicle flying there with the beautiful sunset, that is the cavalry troop that's on the border between northeast Syria and Turkey. And that they are, and if you've been reading the news, they are now training together in Turkey to bring stability to northeast Syria. That's a big deal. That is, in fact, we had to work through a lot of friction there to interoperate, to provide an effect where we could have common goals and procedures, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. So, as I said, 77 nations, 5 national organizations. The geopolitical terrain is complex. Phase 4 operations are occurring on one side of one side of a border. The Syrian political solution is another. You have multiple actors with divergent strategic aims. However, we had one motto in the CJTF, which is one mission and many nations. We came together to make a fist and to lend a helping hand. Interoperability poses challenges across all the echelons, as I said, strategic, operational, and tactical. Advances in modern technology have addressed some of the interoperability issues and raised new ones, but it will never level all the bubbles. Interoperability takes constant work, management, assessment, and communication with a common doctrinal language. It all comes back to doctrine. We strive for cross-domain synergy achieved through coherent, effective, and efficient action at echelon. I got a couple of axioms I try to use to guide folks and just lessons I've learned. One of them is rule number 2, if you can't talk, you can't win. And that really is at the heart of what interoperability is all about. At the strategic level, we live in a world with greater interconnectivity, transparency, and scrutiny, and more than ever before. Coalitions give us the prize of legitimacy more in the information age than it has in the past. It is the paramount importance. You see, our adversaries will do a tactical level event to get a strategic impact in a 24-hour news cycle, not just focused on the Western press, but across the world in all various forms. In all forms, the TV, print, media, you name it, they are communicating, and we are in competition, and interoperability helps us because our partners have different authorities and different rules of engagement that allow for them to perhaps attack a problem set in a different direction. So that's basically what it is at the strategic level. At the operational level, we actually wrote an operation order that was called Op Unity, or Operations Unity, to make sure that our 31 troop contributing nations and 25 representations all had a common language and a common goal. It was to synchronize the resources and authorities from every contributing nation. Phase 4 over there will require continued commitment of our coalition partners and an expansion in financial contributions, capabilities, and numbers of partners. Partner nations comprise the majority of the build partner capacity and enable partner capacity lines of effort. This is perhaps the most critical effort on achieving enduring regional stability. The bottom line there, that we got to take the strengths and opportunities each partner brings and need to understand where one partner can cover the gap of another. Interoperability allows us to do this, and achieving unity of action across a SAJOA of some sort. At the tactical level, Mission Command is what builds this process. BICES was our network, and in partnership with our Iraqi Ops Command, we were interoperable graphics that allowed us to communicate to our partner in military tactical levels and with military graphics and symbols what it is the intent was of the partner, of the mission. Each adversary, so I think you know, or you may not know, we're partnered now at the 6 provincial ops commands. And in those positions, we had to find a common way to project graphics and intent and those kinds of things. BICES gave us that capability. And each advisory team has adjusted the manning of their situations to include their partners in order to leverage the skills and experience of the individuals and small teams. You see, across Iraq, each one of the ops commands is in a different level of war, a different place on the battle space. All have achieved consolidate gains, but how they're achieving the effect of consolidating gains is different. What we were allowed to do through using our interoperability operation, which was Operation Unity, is provide critical enablers, intel fusion, airborne surveillance, and precision strike to support our by, with, and through campaign to focus on the defeat of ISIS. And eventually we'll transition to enable long-term independent capacity with an IA focused on external threats and IPs focused on protection and community. policing. However, we're not there yet. That's the approach that's coming up now. I will tell you that on the tactical level, our Syrian Democratic Force partners and the U.S. Special Forces operators are using a system called Android Tactical Assault Kit, which is an incredible piece of gear that allows them, it's off-the-shelf technology, that allows them to integrate fires and enable the maneuver of our by, with, and through partner force. The information is centralized into one location where the U.S. and the joint partners, they are at a joint operations center. And the feeds are split to protect the classification, which is part of my problem about interoperability, because I'm not sure we understand the language. I had to train 28 foreign disclosure officers. Their sole function in life was to write for release or to proof for release. Writing for release is taking us much longer than it needs to, but I had to do that. So that's 28 officers that had to come out and be focused just on that task alone. That's a big bill to pay, when in fact we need to be able to have decide on a common integrated platform, a common set of language and skills and identifiers and SOPs, and then move forward from there. Okay, so we were able to take these tablets, train partners to use them, and allow them to use them on the battlefield with our trainers right there next to them, with their partners right there with them. An incredible use of technology to enable a by, with, and through force. It is really, really, really well done. So I'll just sum it up there. Those are just a couple of examples. I would be great to answer your questions. I'd love to talk about the information domain if we get the opportunity, or the leadership roles that we're using, where we put, in my case, Felix Gedney to watch me as we interoperate. He's actually assigned to the 3rd Armored Corps, which has been an incredible partnership. He was also in the 1st Armored Division, or 1st Infantry Division, and we have partners in the 1st Armored Division as well. That program works, flat out works. And it allows us to be separated by only a common language. So I will now leave this to General Nick.
Ooh, thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here and an honor to be on the panel. Joe, thank you very much for inviting me. I was reflecting during the Eisenhower lunch yesterday as General Milley was talking about the 82 nations here present, the relationships between those nations. And the good news is that the 82 nations there present, Britain has invaded or occupied every one bar one. So Sweden, you're alone. We're thinking of next year. We're coming through. Those of you who know me know that I am a bit of an amateur fan of history, so I'm going to set my context on interoperability, if I can, in a historical context. And I start really by going back 101 years, when the American Expeditionary Force landed in France in 1917. A few years late, but I'll let that one go. The aide to General John Pershing, one Colonel Charles Stanton, stood in front of the tomb of Lafayette and uttered the words, "Lafayette, nous voilà," or "Lafayette, we are here." A human, personal interoperability. He was honoring, of course, the notable role that Lafayette, a French aristocrat, played in the American Revolutionary Wars, when Britain fought a very, very successful strategic withdrawal from the 13 colonies. Fake news.
Yeah. Felix refers to that as transition.
Yeah, well, Lafayette was a major general when he was 19. We may think about that nowadays. He led American soldiers at the battles of Brandywine, Rhode Island, and the siege of Yorktown. Here's another picture. I always put that one up for some reason. I don't really have much of a point to make, apart from it's a really, really good picture. But actually, the chap in the slide here, George Washington, clearly was commander of the forces of the colonies, and he was up against a chap called General Sir Guy Carleton, who's commander-in-chief of the British forces in North America. For those who don't know, General Sir Guy was our current chief's great-great-great-great-grandfather. I guess my point here is that our history from enmity to amity is replete with the challenges of human interoperability. So let's move on a bit to 100 years ago and our more recent history, which is one of fighting alongside each other. So 100 years ago today, the 100 Days Offensive, the action that would bring the First World War to its bloody conclusion, was still underway. A couple of months previously, at the Battle of Amiens, 10 Allied divisions, the Australians, the British, the Canadian and the French, had achieved surprise and carved a 24-mile gap in the German line. It set the conditions for the advance of the Hindenburg Line. 100 years ago today, the Battle of Cambrai, for the tank dudes out there, a great tank battle, ended. So we are swirling around in history. But the battle I want to talk about is the Battle of St. Quentin Canal, in which the three nations on this panel fought alongside each other for the first time as part of the British Fourth Army. The commander of the British Fourth Army at the time was General Rawlinson, and he wanted the Australians to spearhead the attack. The plan was devised accordingly by the Australian General Sir John Monash. Australian manpower, though, by this stage in the war was much depleted after months of intense fighting, and Rawlinson's solution was to offer Monash the American II Corps, comprising the 27th and the 30th American Divisions. However, the American soldiers at that time lacked battle experience, so a small group of 217 Australian officers and NCOs, think Specialist Assistance Brigades, was assigned to US troops for advice and liaison. The plan was for the Americans to breach the Hindenburg Line, the Australian 3rd and 5 divisions to follow through and exploit the breakout, with the British Corps 3 and 9 deployed in support of the main assault. The battle was preceded by the greatest British artillery bombardment of the war, firing 1 million shells, including 30,000 mustard gas shells. On September the 29th, the 2 American divisions attacked, followed by the 2 Australian divisions, with approximately 150 tanks of the 4th and 5th Tank Brigades of the British Tank Corps, which included the newly trained American 301st Heavy Tank Battalion equipped with British tanks. I bet you never thought that would happen. You can look up yourselves how the battle progressed, a mixture of heroism, setbacks, sacrifices, confusion, the fog of war. But my point is, really, that we have a history of interoperating. An Australian plan, British guns and tanks, divisions of soldiers from 3 nations attacking alongside and through each other, Australian, American and British guts and glory. So fast forward 100 years, and it's fair to say that we now inherit and find ourselves in some institutional and operational spaghetti that we have to untangle. These are our British institutional partners: Finabel, the Five Eyes, ABCANS, the European Union, the Inter-American Defence Board, the United Nations, NATO, the South Atlantic Peace and Cooperation Zone, the European Defence Force, the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force with the French, the Arab League, the European Army, the Joint Expeditionary Force. Each of those institutions requires a discrete, specific set of interoperability challenges. And these are our interoperable operational partnerships. Again, it's quite a complicated slide. The NATO Enhanced Forward Presence in the Baltic States, missions in the Republic of Congo, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Poland, NATO training missions in Afghanistan, in Sahara, in Cyprus, in Lithuania, in Latvia, NATO training missions in Iraq, the EUFOR missions in Chad, in South Sudan, Mali, in Estonia. It's a complicated battle space that we find ourselves inheriting. And as Paul said, these alliances and partnerships and operational groupings bring with them an array of political level agreements. These beget potentially conflicting agendas. They add complexity. They raise the prospect of national caveats affecting the mission employment of forces. The good news is that recent operation experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria demonstrate that high levels of coalition integration are achievable over time as a result of shared experience, similar doctrinal operating processes, both of which have generated a high level of trust. But we know that integration skills are perishable. And so what do we do about that? If success is about changing the opinions and behaviours of those who would do us harm, we do this best by influencing them. Our ability to influence is dependent upon the credibility of our defence. A collective response adds to this credibility, but only if it's coherent. Coherence needs procedures. Ergo, establishing and following a procedural baseline is a bit of a no-brainer, really. And I'd like to say we are making progress in procedural terms, and it was worth highlighting those on the board. Interoperability is now well defined in UK doctrine. We're pushing hard to align with multinational partners, be it through the NATO or the ABCANS process. NATO interoperability policy is being rewritten. There's a writing team which comprises officers from Canada, from France, from Germany, from the United Kingdom, from the United States, exporting our bilateral multinational works to the benefit of the NATO community. At the tactical level, we've got strong procedural affinity between formations, well exemplified by the relationships between 16 Air Assault Brigade from the United Kingdom, the French 11th Parachute Brigade, and the American 82nd Airborne Division. We routinely exchange DCGs across formations. British officers serve as DCGs here in 3 Corps, Felix, in the 82nd Airborne Division and in the 1st Armoured Division. And in a reciprocal manner, we have in the 3rd Division, Doug previously there as the DCG, and also in HQ Allied Rapid Reaction Corps. And we have the same relationship with the French, who provided DCG into the UK division. And there was a time last year, for a month, when Doug was in charge of 3 UK div, and the French DCG was in charge of 1 div. So both of the British warfighting divisions were being commanded by officers of other nations. That is a fantastic level of human interoperability, for which I think we should all be proud. Developing bilaterally agreed procedures is also hugely important. As Joe said, we visited Grafenwehr earlier this year to go to the joint warfighting exercise to see how 1st UK Brigade was plugging into the US division at the time. What we saw was impressive. I compare it to what I saw in Fort Bliss on NIE about 3 years ago, when the same brigade had been out, and basically interoperability at that stage was human, it was swivel chair, it was talking human to human. It wasn't actually anything more than that. What I saw this time was common operating procedures, was digital files, was secure voice. It was actually about passage of information in a very, very swift and usable fashion. So we're doing that well at that level, but I would also contend that our sustainment interoperability has been a poor cousin for too long. It's the least well understood, hardest to exercise, arguably most complex, and potentially the most critical element of interoperability. So I'd like us to see us do far more in this area, exposing some of the vagaries of our national caveats and legal impositions for electronic countermeasures, rules of engagement, CPERS policy, ammunition sharing, use of blood, to name but a few. To go back in history again and set it into context, all 3 nations on this panel fought in the Korean War to a greater or lesser extent. We had 4 different logistic systems in Korea at that time. The US were responsible for their own troops. The US were responsible for logistic support for certain allies. The Republic of Korea used their own systems and drew on those of the United States. The British and Commonwealth had their own logistic systems. For the US supporting allies, there were considerable challenges. The Turkish contingent needed rations without pork. The Thai contingent needed extra rice and smaller uniforms. The Ethiopians arrived with British uniforms, but no weapons. Procedural solutions are needed to mitigate such logistic challenges. And the same in the area of ammunition. One of the UK's roles was to provide artillery support to the United States and to the Republic of Korea units. The US provided radios and forward observation officers and a common language. The Koreans lacked the language skills to explain what was needed, but could indicate on a map where they wanted to provide effect. So successful interoperability sometimes requires procedures that work with peers and less developed forces at the same time. Everyone is not born equal in terms of technological development. And even when allies do have extensive experience of working together, there can be a breakdown in communications. So in April 1951, the British Gloucester Battalion was isolated at the Imjin River, with Chinese soldiers overwhelming their position. The British brigade commander at the time, Tim Brodie, described the situation as a bit sticky. His superior American Corps headquarters did not appreciate the British tendency to understate the gravity of a situation. And it was some time, therefore, before a relief force was sent, by which time the glorious Gloucesters, as we know them, had all but ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Procedures are necessary, common language is important. So we're not talking, from my perspective, about something new here. We're trying to relearn lessons of the past. We know the problem, and we know what we must do. And Joe and Paul have talked to it. But it takes time, it takes will, and it takes considerable resource. Interoperability should be built into future equipment at the design stage. But that's complicated, and it's costly, and it's frequently traded out. So if the technical can be traded out in some areas, procedural interoperability is increasingly, from my view, a non-discretionary approach. So back to Lafayette and Stanton's nous voilà. That's a much better position to be in. As Churchill famously said, there's only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that's fighting without them. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Some things don't change about you. All right, Kat, you're up.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, sir. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a great pleasure to be here. What a really interesting panel, and a very important panel. By way of introduction, my appointment is Head of Land Capability within the Australian Army Headquarters. My team and I are responsible for end-to-end management of capability, and what that means is we think about the future Army from a concepts and needs perspective. We do requirements definition for planned capability ranging from helicopters through to radios to rifles through to watercraft, and we also look after the sustainment budget of Army. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about current technology, future technology and money. Hence, it's a real pleasure today to be asked to talk about something other than that. I've been asked to talk about the human dimension of interoperability. The Australian Army is a relatively small army. We are defending a very large island in quite a dynamic part of the world. And we absolutely consider interoperability to be key to our future operational success. And when we talk about interoperability, we talk about interoperability with our sister services, as well as with our allies and our regional partners. Of all aspects of interoperability dealt with the panel, I actually believe that the human dimension is the one that has significant potential to address shortcomings in other areas. As was really effectively communicated during the opening session of AUSA, despite all our technological advances, the profession of arms remains an inherently human one, whether at peace, in competition or conflict. Humans wage war, not machines. Similarly, humans make peace. They support others in time of need and work together during periods of competition to shape or set conditions for the achievement of mutual interests. As General Pope explained, the Australian, the United States and the British armies have a century-long history of pursuing the human dimension of interoperability. I will also take you back to World War I, also to a battle led by General Sir John Monash. At 3:10 a.m. on the morning of 4th of July 1918, 244 US soldiers of Alpha Company, 132nd Regiment, United States Army, fought in the Battle of Hamel in northern France with the Australians of 13th Battalion under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Marks. Marx was only 22 years old, but was already an experienced combat leader of Australian infantry from the Gallipoli campaign, including the landing at Anzac and many battles on the Western Front. He was fondly referred to by his men as the boy colonel. The Australian and Americans' combined objective was a line just past Vere Wood. The attack was a resounding success. The objective was achieved with minimal casualties by 6 a.m. The first US Army Medal of Honour in World War I was awarded for action during this battle to Corporal Thomas Pope of the US 131st Infantry Regiment, Illinois National Guard.
Great surname.
The Battle of Hamel was the first time US troops fought under another nation's tactical command, and it is the first recorded practical demonstration of interoperability between our two armies. Key to the ability of the American doughboys and the Australian diggers to successfully fight together during the Battle of Hamel was the human dimension of interoperability. The War Diary of 13th Battalion records how Douglas Marks achieved this, bringing the men of Alpha Company into the battalion on the night of the 29th of June. He kept a small nucleus with the battalion headquarters and assigned an American platoon to each of his 4 rifle companies. This arrangement facilitated the issue of orders and rehearsals. But most importantly, the 4 days of close integration allowed friendships, understanding, and personal relationships to develop. The realisation of this human dimension in the absence of other areas of interoperability proved invaluable. Human interoperability 100 years ago was fighting side by side, direct people-to-people contacts, achieving victory across cultures and experience levels, despite the disadvantages of being divided by a common language. The human dimension of interoperability is just as important today as it was then. The Australian Army has and always will fight alongside allies and partners. It is what we do for good reason. As our Chief of Defence Force, Army General Angus Campbell, said just last week, if you are not working to build relationships to understand your region and to understand how to work with others, you are potentially leaving yourself open to not being as effective and as powerful as you might be. Coalitions of nations and militaries within coalitions working in partnership present an opportunity for a defence force of considerable capability but modest size to be even more effective because we are working together with others. In my opinion, it is guaranteed that technical, logistical, conceptual, procedural and national security caveated barriers to interoperability will endure in various forms, despite our best efforts. This is not admitting defeat, nor am I suggesting we give up on the pursuit of enhanced interoperability in all the areas the panel are addressing today. Far from it. The juice is definitely worth the squeeze for any possible interoperability gains in an age of accelerated warfare and rapid technological development. But we must also be pragmatic. Obvious challenges and opportunities come to mind when we think about the human dimension of interoperability, ones involving language and terminology and education. Us native English or Australian speakers need to show empathy and slow down when talking to partners who may only have a rudimentary understanding of our language. Love your work, sir. And avoid using terms and phrases that don't translate simply. Apparently, only Australians talk about hitting the frog and toad, meaning getting on the road. And who would have thought that flat out like a lizard drinking does not immediately translate to being busy? Whenever possible, we need to simplify staff work and use commonly agreed terminology. Fortunately, we are ahead of the game in many of these areas. This is because of the good work of our people on all sides and through forums, as has been already mentioned, such as ABCANS and NATO. As has also been discussed throughout AUSA and very clearly explained by Lieutenant General Funk, trust is undoubtedly the key to working with partners. Trust allows us to transcend cultural differences, those differences in our ideas, customs and social behaviours, shaped by such things as national histories, geography and economic prosperity. When it comes to working with partners, it is no longer good enough to just know ourselves, know our enemy and know our terrain. We must also know our partners. In addition to contributing to operations across the globe, the Australian Army prioritises getting to know and understand our partners. We have our global Defence Attaché and Liaison Network, long-term exchanges with 260 Army folk permanently stationed overseas, regular formal bilateral and multilateral discussions, regular training activities and exercises held in both Australia and our partner nations. Talisman Sabre, the biennial US-Australian exercise, involved 33,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen and Marines last year. We also have a habitual relationship framework for our region, within which each of our combat brigades is partnered with a specific regional partner nation for training and exercise purposes. We use our training institutions and higher command and staff colleges to build the people-to-people relationships that are key to breaking down language and cultural barriers, and most importantly, building mutual understanding and trust. And of course, we also come to activities like AUSA and participate in panels such as this. An important caveat needs to be agreed. If we see enhancing the human dimension as being about replication and duplication of thought, or removal of variation and difference in the pursuit of universal shared conformity, then we are pursuing fool's gold. The diversity our alliance and coalition partners bring to our shared endeavours are a strength, not a weakness. The art and science of developing the human dimension of interoperability and our challenge is to achieve understanding and clarity, but never at the collective expense of our unique individual strengths. Before closing, I'd like to reflect upon something the Commander AUSA said last month during his presentation on multi-domain operations at Land Forces 2018 in Adelaide, South Australia. General Brown described the challenges across the technical, procedural and institutional gaps which must be addressed for multi-domain operations to succeed. He concluded the challenges were many and profound, but observed it was the people-to-people connections that would make it work. I think he is right, and that this offers us a way ahead. Ultimately, it is in the people-to-people connections, the human dimension of interoperability, where we will find our answers to the enduring challenges of interoperability. Finally, to finish up, I thought I'd share with you an excerpt from the US Serviceman's Guide to Australia from World War II. You and your outfit have been ordered to Australia as part of a worldwide offensive. You're going to meet a people who like Americans and whom you will like. The Australians have much in common with us. They're a pioneer people. They believe in personal freedom. They love sports and they're out to lick the enemy all the way. But there are a lot of differences too. Their ways of living and thinking of all sorts of things, like tea, central heating, the best way to spend Sunday, or saluting officers and such. You'll find out all about those But the main point is they like us and we like them. Thank you.
All right, Doug. Thanks, Kat.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Doug Chrisman, I'm currently the director of the Mission Command Center of Excellence out at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. We've had an opportunity to hear a number of great examples of how human and procedural efforts can enable, and certainly do enable, interoperability. But I think it's safe to say that progress made in the technical dimension, the dimension General Anderson described as the sexy part, can enable interoperability at a much faster rate and across a much broader scale. And as as General Funk said, rule number 2: if you can't talk, you can't win. We recognize that sometimes we, the United States Army, as you, our allies and partners and friends, attempt to partner, train, and prepare to warfight with us, that we often make it difficult to partner with us. And it's often in that technical dimension where we pose and some of the greatest obstacles to that interoperability. So we want to make it easier to train and fight with us, and we've taken some deliberate steps in the recent months to be able to factor interoperability into our technical approach. Recently, I spent 2 years with the British Army in the mighty 3rd UK Division, during which time I had the opportunity to listen to General Pope show his slide on the White House in flames a number of times. General, I think it may be time for some new material. But I had the opportunity, we, the 3rd UK Division, and I was the DCG, had the opportunity to participate in 2 U.S. warfighter exercises at Fort Bragg as a first ever training experience at the division level for the British Army. We were fortunate to have most of the same leaders and key staff officers participate in both exercises that were separated by about 10 months. In the first warfighter exercise in June of 2017, and many of you in the room will remember it, there was no mission partner environment. There was no common network for which all nations could communicate effectively. SIPR was the warfighting enclave. The information was largely transmitted through so-called swivel chair operations between incompatible US and UK digital systems. With almost no ability to leverage the technical domain, we leaned heavily on human and procedural efforts, flooded the U.S. headquarters with liaison officers, had frequent voice-only conference calls to share information and build situational awareness, and we adapted and overcame as best we could. It was a great training experience, but left many of my British mates and me feeling it could have been much better, and we, the 3rd UK Division, could have contributed so much more to the fight. Fortunately, the U.S. Army felt the same way, and the enterprise swept into action to design and establish a mission partner environment, an MPE, at the secret releasable 5I level for the next warfighter only 10 months later. The difference between the 2 training experiences was massive, for both nations, really. It took us a better part of 4 months of technical risk reduction efforts to get everything to work. But the results were well worth the effort, and the training impact was felt down to the lowest British and American soldier who participated. The past 18 months have been particularly instructive for us as we have made significant progress on the mission partner environment as our default warfighting enclave. This concept is not a new one. We use a version of the MPE in our deployed theaters today. Many of you are familiar with Centrix K, Centrix A, Centrix I. Several of our Army Service Component Commands already employ a version of an MPE to integrate their coalition teammates, and NATO has, of course, used a NATO secret mission network approach for years as a common technical baseline to bring multiple nations, echelons, and capabilities together. In fact, NATO's annual Steadfast Cobalt is a SACEUR-directed COMEX to ensure those common technical standards required to join the NATO secret network are known and validated regularly. The single hardest thing to do in Warfighter 18.4 that I spoke about, it was just 6 months ago here in the U.S., was convince the U.S. that we could actually exercise mission command, warfight, on a network other than SIPR. And that MPE enclave, an MPE enclave established at a mission secret level would actually give us nearly all the information that we needed. There will certainly always be reasons why we have niche reasons to execute operations on SIPR and be able to leverage those capabilities using cross-domain solutions to bring them onto the warfighting enclave. But driving the paradigm shift to making the SecRel enclave our default warfighting network during both combat and training will bolster our interoperability progress. So building on the right for release memo General Anderson mentioned earlier, there are policy and cultural shifts that drive us from a need to know to a need to share mindset in the U.S. Army. Many of you, our allies and partners, are already there. We've got to get there and make sure that the coalition is strengthened as a result. And we recognize these shifts won't happen overnight, and they require some catalysts to drive that need for change. Warfighter 18.4 was just one catalyst that raised awareness of the problem and helped deliver a solution and illustrate the impact of that solution to our Army senior leaders. And we see three useful catalysts in the near future, being Warfighter 19.4 in April, where the UK is bringing their 3rd Division back to fight again with alongside the U.S. 1st Infantry Division and underneath General Funk's 3rd U.S. Corps. And then immediately followed by an experimentation opportunity at JBLM in Fort Lewis, Washington in May as an opportunity to experiment a bit more on the margins, followed by Pacific Pathways and, of course, Defender 20 in 2020. Today, we're integrating network standards aligned with NATO's Federated Mission Network and ABCANS into our mission partner environment and broader Mission Command network modernization efforts, with interoperability as a fundamental design principle, not an afterthought, as it has been in the past. We're evaluating software partitioning solutions for separating classification enclaves that could actually enable us to accommodate a wider range of mission partners without increasing size, weight, power requirements, or reducing the mobility of our command posts. We're integrating multilateral standards such as the Multilateral Interoperability Program, or MIP, for COP exchange, and the Artillery Systems Cooperation Activities, ASCA, for digital fires into our functional applications. In fact, we've learned some things from many of you as we've trained with you in the recent past, and we're now on a course to leverage a commercial off-the-shelf product many of you will recognize as the core system in our command post computing environment, which is our future COP tool. To improve digital fires interoperability, we've expanded the scope of our annual dynamic front fires exercise. We fully support the efforts of ASCA as an international community of interest focused on standardizing message formats and digital protocols for fire mission planning and execution. In an effort to make our AFATAD system more interoperable, future versions will be software-based and hardware agnostic, making it far easier for our partners to be able to share that digital fires data. We recently ratified the U.S. Army contribution to the ABCAN Statements of Requirements for COP and tactical radios and have begun development of similar statements of requirements for network transport and sustainment. And while we admit we shouldn't set our interoperability aim point at the lowest common denominator, we acknowledge we must strive to develop open standards wherever feasible to enable accessibility to a broader spectrum of our allies and partners. We believe that integrating multinational training objectives into scheduled training exercises is the fastest and most comprehensive way to drive this progress. So where are we headed in the near future? We're moving towards a common operating environment, COE, which will converge multiple standalone systems onto common hardware and software as integrated applications. This common operating environment will provide a common implementation of computing technologies and standards applied across 6 computing environments, ranging from the individual soldier to the command post. These computing environments will provide common infrastructure, applications, and services to enhance planning, collaboration, and execution. A fundamental principle of the common operating environment is the ability to leverage commercial off-the-shelf technology and replicate the common look and feel of commercial computing and mobile devices to increase simplicity and intuitiveness. In fact, the first component of the common operating environment, the command post computing environment, is being informed by technical and policy progress achieved by ABCANS. As we look into the future a little bit further, we must continue the dialogue on how we will operate together in the cyber domain. In Sabre Strike 18, we saw the first employment of tactical defensive infrastructure capability, or TDI, by a joint cyber protection team on an MPE. There's work to be done, and much of it our allies and partners are already in front of us. But we must identify common operational requirements in the cyber domain and pursue technical solutions in that space together. And our systems and levels of as our systems and levels of interoperability mature, we'll also need to work together to integrate other emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and autonomous systems to remain relevant against superior threats. Thanks.
Intel, fire, sustainment, where the gaps are. Thanks, Doug. Okay, folks, that's the formal pitches. We're now into Q&A. I think we got about 40, 45 minutes, so the time is yours. I'm going to kick this thing off, though. I'm going to ask Paul. He was talking about the gaps and how one partner has to cover another partner when they have capability gaps. And so I'd like to ask you, based on your CJTF hat, but also as a Corps commander, as you look at how we are prioritizing interoperability efforts from a common operating picture, intel, fires, sustainment, do we have it right?
We're starting on the right path. It would be the answer to that. But for example, the Brits have a great deal more liberal application of the information environment and what things that they can apply, what tools they can use on the various networks, and what information that they can disclose. They're much more. Our biggest problem in the maneuver safe or the common operational picture is our propensity to hide position location. And in a static location, in a coin environment, I can see that. But in a maneuver fight, in an operational context, as you're moving across the battlefield, we do not need to guard our position location for longer than, say, 15 minutes based on the news threat. If the chief says we're going to jump our command posts every hour at echelon, well, if the enemy can catch up that fast on us, there's no need for that. Right. So part of that's our biggest problem in release is our position location. On the fires piece, I think it's clearance of fires. It's different, and that becomes more of a procedural issue, and as it relates to authorities to attack targets and how you define what an enemy activity is. So that's more of a practice, a trust, and an interoperability piece on the human dimension. We all have national caveats as it relates to the release of weapon systems, et cetera. Understanding those, it makes this a bit more complex, but dealing with those and developing who has better tools to attack the target that you want to use, for example, EW. In the electronic warfare, there are active passive systems. There are gaps there that we need to understand because we are going to operate as a coalition, and who has what systems in an offensive fight and how they protect their forces is really going to be important going on in the future. So we really have to look at that piece.
No, thank you. Good. Okay, I think we had.
Ma'am, gentlemen, my name is Lieutenant Colonel Eric Duckworth. I work for Office of Congressional Legislative Liaison. First off, General Popesar, I want to thank you and your staff and the embassy for being such gracious hosts last night. Thank you, sir. My question is, with regards to our respective legislatures, Parliament and Congress, what areas, what messages, what demonstrations would you like them to observe and understand? And then are there any authorities or potential obstacles you would like them to, that are outside of your service perspectives, that you would like them to review and potentially remove?
Want to take that one, Ernie?
So thanks for the question. It's quite interesting, this. In one respect, we've got a defense forces structure that's trying to repair the Tower of Babel that we've kind of inherited over the last 15 or 20 years. And so striving, as we've been talking about on the panel, towards greater interoperability has been, I think, a really successful story in many respects. But at the political level, and certainly at the legal level, you can see the battleground moving in a different direction. driven by social media, by the immediacy of the current political battle space, and the need from a political perspective to desensitize, to have a rather more safe approach to life. So the question you raise is in many respects, is a wicked problem for us. And I don't have an easy answer, if I was to be honest. I think that where I would go is, as we unpack the ability to do common operating fires, releasability or whatever, we will abut policy decisions on a sequential basis. And I think it's for us as the soldiers in the room, really, to go back through our legal and political masters when we face a challenge, to talk about how we might influence or change policy to account for. And I'll give you the example of use of bloods across national boundaries. Currently, it's an area that's a problem for us. So sharing medical resources, sharing blood. We've done it in combat in terms of necessity, but we can't institutionalize it. So I think what I would be looking for as we go through war fighters is to pick off one by one those areas of policy that we think make a difference. A challenge.
Perhaps if I could just add to that. Our government has actually been very clear to us in terms of priority for interoperability. Our first priority is to be interoperable with our other two services, and we recently went through a very significant review whereby the chair of our investment committee, who allocates funding for capability, is actually a joint officer. So he who controls the money controls investment decisions. So very joint. We buy a lot of capability from the US. If I could just put a plug in, our Air Force buys US Air Force and US Navy platforms and has an internal interoperability issue as a result. We would very much like our closest ally to also really prioritise that joint interoperability. So first priority, just a plug, sir. Our first priority is joint. Our second priority is with the US because the ANZUS alliance underpins our defence strategy, so that's very clear. That sounds easy to achieve, but the US is a very big organisation. We talk about interoperability often in terms of seamless integration. As a communicator, it is much more difficult than that. We are now going through a process led by our military attaché here in Washington to actually prioritise what we mean from an interoperability perspective with the US. A very close second is obviously interoperability with our APCANS partners.
Thanks, Kat. Anyone? Shirley. Go ahead.
Peter Hurley, AUSA's European Affairs guy. Tremendous panel, and thank you very much, sir, for bringing everyone together. After the first Gulf War, which was a more or less interoperable success, General Powell made a remark to the staff that it was a product of good liaison, which was achieved in spite of the fact that liaison in the U.S. military was somewhat lower than whale urine on the standard of values. He didn't use the word urine. And that's a long time later. You've got advisory brigades in Afghanistan, everything that you've all been talking about, but I'm wondering in the human dimension, on our side, and perhaps the British and Australians could comment as well, have you got procedures in place to improve the prestige of that, the career impact of operating on the scene? It's a little bit of a general question, but I think it relates to the human dimension. Even if we solve all the technical problems, I think the human dimension prevails.
All right, thanks, Peter. Good question. Yeah, I think with respect to the, I'll speak on the SFAB piece, and then Nick, Kat, Paul, Doug, you guys can comment too. The issue there is correct. It was not the technical aspect of the SFAB was not the issue at all, because we bought already tested SOF kit off the shelf and it moved like that. Again, but Kat, based on your comment, that was all a reset, it was above threshold reprogramming. That took a little bit of time on the Hill to get the money. But it came, and once the money came, we kitted them out, and that was not the challenge. So I think that context, again, when you're in a train, advise, assist, a company enable role, I think you find when you're plugging people into going back out to the concepts we were when we first went in there now on our 18th year of doing this, when we first sent folks in there, when you're going to put people out and get them off of fobs and actually embed them in units and actually, again, a company enable, that's a game changer. And I think the human dimension, we didn't get the first one quite right because the first one had to get out the door at a much more accelerated pace to try and affect the strategy in Afghanistan. So a lot of the cultural, and again, and what we heard time and time and time again from all the MACV folks in Vietnam was the language, how critical the language piece was. And the good news right now is we're watching the training timeline for SFAB number 1 versus SFAB number 2. The amount of that language training has exponentially increased to allow them to be more capable when they hit the ground. That will continue to get better and better and better after we go to the successive SFABs. But I think knowing what their roles and missions there are not changed because those individuals, as you know, have already done that in some other capacity, typically, again, from a unit perspective, maybe from a back when we had the old teams on the ground. But I think the issue mostly from the human dimension was, again, some of the cultural, but I believe the huger one was the language. Again, the communication comment that Kat was talking about, you know, I just recall back to being surrounded by your Australian buddies down there every morning at the IJC bub. We would come out of the bub and we'd go do a 20-minute around the staff, who's doing what, and we'd spend 10 minutes trying to figure out what the Aussies were saying. And the Brits were right behind it. And then once we got through that, we could move out. But I think that's probably from an SFAB specific perspective would be, I think, the biggest piece. Nick?
So I'd reinforce that from a British perspective. So that particular level about interoperability with the partner nations that you are seeking either to influence or to fight alongside at the lower level. You'd use SFAB, I use SPIB, Specialist Infantry Battalion. We're also creating 4 currently, maybe another one on the route soon. Really to look about how you do long-term regional alignment better than we've done hitherto. So the way we've traditionally fought, which is kind of incidental, you go in, you have a bit of a kick around and you come out again, doesn't really work particularly well. So I'm also a huge fan of greater regionally aligned forces. I think at the military to military level, Peter, which I think also is your question, the human dynamics, I think we're getting better there. I mean, Felix has been mentioned a couple of times as the sort of the DCG for Ball in 3 Corps, and you know, at one level I consider and say as the senior appointing officer or one of the people who appoints people like Felix to these jobs, we say, what are we going to do with Felix? I know, let's give him back to the Americans. Yeah. But actually at another level, the fact that somebody can come back to either America or to France or Germany on a number of occasions and actually maintain a long-term relationship, I think is hugely important. And I think that's been something that's really driven us really since we went into you know, Afghanistan and Iraq for the last 20 years or so. I think the connectivity between all of our nations has been better aligned, much better aligned over the last 2 decades than it certainly was during the Cold War years. So, you know, grounds for cautious optimism from my perspective.
Yeah, it really boils down to trust. That's what it boils down to. And so your liaison officer, for example, mine most recently back at CENTCOM headquarters was a former brigade commander of mine. So I took the opportunity to put quality people. Felix excluded, the partner nations send tremendously capable officers and NCOs to our units and headquarters, and that has been a remarkable increase in our trust, which leads to getting after. Once you've established the trust, you can work through all the various issues that come on the technical means of these things. But it is the trust, just like it is between leaders to lead and juniors to seniors. Yep. That is important in everything we do.
Okay.
Yes, we talk about there being 2 states in the future, competition and conflict, and we've got to invest in competition to avoid moving to the second state, which is conflict. The way to do that is absolutely to invest in those human dimension interoperability skills. We now take our best, it hasn't always been the case, we now take our best and brightest and we put them in key positions in the US, and we've got our LOs sitting up the back here, and also in the region. Often our military attaches come out of command, whether it's unit command or brigade command. It's that important. We're making sure that we're really investing. I mentioned the habitual framework that we've established. Each of our combat brigades is aligned with a regional partner nation. I recently went and visited our 3rd Brigade on exercise, and I flew into the exercise with the Deputy Chief of Army of the PNG Army, and he was going there to talk to his friend and colleague, the brigade commander of the 3rd Brigade, and they are helping each other. Leadership is a lonely role. They are absolutely supporting each other. They share lessons learned. They train together. They are there to support each other. And in the future, those relationships, that trust will absolutely matter.
Doug, comment?
I'd just add, sir, that, you know, we've talked about exchanging liaison officers and populating one another's armies with exchange folks, and of course that's a very valuable opportunity for both sides. But we also do a number of exchanges in the professional military education realm, and oftentimes that's a place as we all get busy. For us to say, we're too busy to send a collection of our best and brightest to someone else's nation. We need to keep them to ourselves and train them in our own PME environments. But that relationship, by surrounding themselves with somebody other than folks that have grown up in their own army, exposes not just them, but the rest of the members of that partner nation to the way that those other nations think. And it's a tremendous opportunity at all levels for our NCO PME courses, our officer PME courses, up to and including the Army War College. We've even got allies and partners going on our general officer capstone course now. And those opportunities, I think, are very valuable to maintain in some of those relationships.
Huge. Thanks. Absolutely. Thanks. Go ahead.
Sirs, ma'am, good morning. Colonel Mark Comer from headquarters of the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps in the United Kingdom. In our current and future conflicts, the coherence of our alliance and coalitions is likely to be one of our key centers of gravity that's going to be attacked by our adversary, particularly in the information domain. I just wonder, in your own views, how do we improve all elements of interoperability to win the battle of the narrative across our nations and partners? Thank you.
It's not that they're going to do, they're doing it now. I mean, just look at what kind of interactions you're having between Turkey and us. You know, they're attacking, our adversaries are attacking those partnerships right now. What really boils down to is trust. And you have to maintain, reestablish, and continually nurture a trusting relationship.
So it's a question that I saw quite recently. Actually, I think it was in the Libyan construct, particularly when we were having a little contretemps with the Libyans a couple of years ago. And it's quite difficult at times to work out when you're fighting in a coalition who's got responsibility for the narrative. It's far easier when you go into a conflict where you've got a very clear end state that you can align behind and develop a strategic communications perspective from which you can shape your narrative. And I think it's oftentimes we don't really have that as clear as we might do. So part of the solution set therefore is to, at the coalition level, have that strategic narrative from the word go. And Paul talked to that very, very clear mission statement, mission set that he had operating with his coalition partners in Syria and Iraq. And where it comes under challenge is when things go wrong. I saw it in Afghanistan when I was there, when David Richards was commanding ISAF, that David Richards would spend probably 50–60% of his time upwards and outwards into political capitals of the world, persuading, cajoling, influencing politicians, political masters to stay with the cause. So it's a really hard ask, this, and I think it basically kicks at using your commanders to shape and influence upwards and outwards in a sort of a chairman capacity, as much as being the chief exec fighting the fight, which is in many respects the easier battle.
That answer your question?
No, sir.
Okay, all right, good. Felix?
So a couple of comments, if I can, then there is a question. The first relates to the human dynamic and the procedure and the doctrine. And it's really just a reminder that that doesn't happen automatically. It has to be operationalized. And the way we do that is through giving orders and translating that doctrine and procedure into orders which are then tracked and executed. Second comment relates to the discussion over how we integrate the best from all the allies. And I would direct everyone to look very closely at the air domain. This is done every day routinely with the dynamic targeting in the air domain. And there's probably things we can learn from the way that happens. It's done very effectively with red card holders, working out what targets can be done in a very, very fast way. My question has nothing to do with that. My question is, how are we getting on with pushing past the Five Eyes? It's not just those 5 nations that fight, and we've got to be able to integrate further than that. What are we doing about that?
I'll start with that, and then we'll let these guys comment, and gals. I think that goes back to this, for us, that fusion cell that we're establishing to get all these, again, it is bigger than the Five Eyes, to get them all in the same room on a day-to-day basis to make sure that they're communicating, exchanging ideas. And the real key, I think, is back to the gaps question. What does each respective nation, what's their approach vis-a-vis how they're attacking the COP, the intel, the fires, and sustainment? And all of us, well, there are some similarities and there are some greater differences, but how do you all have a common view on what the procedural way ahead is, and then how do you measure that? And that goes back to where you call in the ABCANS piece. How are you establishing the metrics to determine each nation's capability to shoot, move, communicate? I think as you look at every exercise that we're talking about, we've all mentioned exchanges across every front. As you look at those lines of effort from earlier, those are all being expanded to a much greater audience than Five Eyes, and then it becomes the cultural thing. You know, saying right to release comes off your lips pretty easily, but when it comes to actually putting pen to paper and what that means, it doesn't quite. And there are still people that are, for whatever reason, I'll call it risk adverse, I'll call it fear, I'll call it whatever you want to call it, that don't conceptualize what that means. And any one of us that's been a jock in downtown Baghdad or in Kabul or wherever the case may be and think you're going to play games with what you're going to share with your partners who are out there getting after it just like you are, that's the problem.
So I'll make 2 comments. Firstly, on your first observation about the air domain and your partner in crime, Gav Parker, Air Vice Marshal, sitting next to you. My point about the air domain would be actually about training. So in the British system, we've had a fairly mature relationship with training pilots on Typhoon fast jets at our RAF stations in UK at Cranwell. It was interesting last year that the top, so basically you've got Saudi Arabian pilots and British pilots training together. The top pilot on last year's course was a Saudi Arabian pilot, which says one of 2 things. Either that the course is extremely mature or that we're bringing some completely inadequate people into our Royal Air Force. I leave it to your judgment. On the issue of broadening beyond Five Eyes, it's a fair challenge, that question. But I would take you've got to have a forcing function. If you've got a large coalition, you can operate at 2 speeds. You can operate at the speed of the slowest partner there present, which is in some of our national institutions, be it NATO, be it the United Nations or whatever, sometimes is the mechanism. Or you can have a forcing function. And I think what we've used Five Eyes and ABCANS to do over the last 3 or 4 years is a forcing function, either within broader coalition partnerships, NATO or the like, or as a mechanism to move interoperability forward, particularly in the technical area. But it is, as Joe says, it's not the final solution. So I absolutely welcome the idea of this kind of fusion cell to really share across a broader spectrum of countries who will be part of a coalition that are willing, wherever we are, some of the work that we're doing to advance it. So think of it as a forcing function rather than exclusivity.
The only thing I would add is if you try and do everything, you'll do nothing particularly well. We believe that there will continue to be levels of interoperability, and those levels will be related to the degree of trust. And for us, ABCANS is the highest level of trust.
That's the goal. But it goes back to Kat's comment about relationships, and again, I think, and also one more piece, Felix, is a regional approach. We're all talking this way, those of us up on this dais and everybody else, we're dealing with our, from expanding a bilateral approach to things to a multilateral approach to things. You know, if you're part of a neighborhood, then you probably need to be at the table, and it's not just me and you talking across the table, it's us talking around the table. I think that's another approach we're getting after. Yes, ma'am.
Major General Chrisman, I just want to say I admired your speech because it honed in on something that we have been doing a lot at JIDO. My name is Robin Landry. I'm a retired Air Force colonel, and I work and partner greatly with Army and all the services, and as well as our coalition partners, the Five Eyes, and all of you. And I have the deepest respect for where I work and, you know, my military experience. What I wanted to ask you, sir, you brought up a great concept that I think that the Army actually probably developed at JIDO, but it sort of expanded, whereby you want to, when we develop tools and technologies for the Army or for any of the services, that we work side by side with our coalition partners to do that. And that's sort of like a construct we've had for a number of years, whereby at JIDO, we work, the operator and the intelligence officer and the technician work directly together, and we develop tools that are usable and are and can be deployed rapidly within a matter of months or even a day if the need is there. I have seen that turn around where I work. The question I would like to ask you, we looked at, you know, people as a component for, you know, making this liaison happen, changing tactics, techniques, and procedures for that. But I was looking at in the realm of technology, and I didn't know if you were aware of this or not. We are working closely with our Five Eye partners to what we call a concept of bring your own data. And what it does in your different domains, you can bring your data to us, and your data is protected. But what it does is combine all of the data so it illuminates other threats or illuminate other targets or something like that. And for example, at JIDO, we hosted, ma'am, the Australian Federal Police Commissioner, who's equivalent to the FBI, in our enclave. We couldn't do the experiment at JIDO, but we actually did it at the National Targeting Center at DHS. And this is an unclassified experiment, but they actually brought their data. And through this system, you know, just algorithms and integration, we were able to combine their data with ours, but still protect the integrity of everybody's data. But what it did, it illuminated other targets. And this, to me, is a stopgap measure. And I'm sure General Chrisman, you probably are aware of it. But I just thought, are there any other stopgap measures that we can probably think of in the realm of technology until we reach that desired end state of developing common tools that we all can use?
Well, thanks for your question, and you bring up a great point. You know, operating the capability, the technical capability that we want to be able to deliver at the edge to the warfighter, at some point or another relies on pulling data to be able to drive operations, for instance, intel sources as an example, or storing data that is a result. And as our network matures and as we advance concepts like the mission partner environment, storing and securing and locating our data is certainly something that is a concern. So using and leveraging capabilities like the cloud to be able to have data somewhere else other than on the battlefield, how much of the data that we need to be at the place we call the edge, which is forward, where the command posts are, where the operators are, at the tip of the spear. Those are absolutely considerations as we advance this concept of a mission partner environment, and as we advance the concept of managing where and how, where we locate and how we secure our data moving forward.
Yeah, because I think there's in the realm of technology that we could probably develop in the short term, TTPs to sort of enhance our ability to share data with what we already have. Because a lot of times there's a long tail to get to that end state. But in the meantime, like you said, in terms of readiness and in terms of mission need, we got to do it now, and we can't wait for this, this long-term thing, this perfect tool to come up. And but I really want to say I was really fascinated with the MPE, and I want to explore it more and bring that information to our big data analytics folks at where I work. Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Anyone?
So, Howard Tweedy, a slightly prosaic question. I'm a Navy officer, so it really shouldn't be here at all, really. We've experienced over the last 20 years the long war. The noughts and ones have won. The compute function is there. What we're now facing is how we gain access to information to understand kill chain, etc. The cycle outside in Commercial Street is turning faster than the analysis that you've presented us today in terms of this year, next year, year after, in terms of exercises and so forth. Commercial life is six months. We're talking 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. And also the expertise, the SQEP to deliver that, suitably qualified and experienced people to deliver that is a rare beast. How are you going to address those challenges, the churn, the cycle, and get stuff to the edge that we keep talking about? The elephant in the room. I've heard a lot of good TDP, SOP, people, wetware, we know that. How are we going to address what's really facing out there, which is the gig, the web, the information domain?
Okay.
So I'll kick off if I may, and then Doug can add some technical detail. It's quite interesting sitting on a stand as a Royal Signals officer next to a sort of a combat guy where he's got the technical side and I'm Mr. Thicko in the middle here. So it's an interesting question. I think all of our nations are struggling with how you have an acquisition cycle, which we all get rather thwarted by the bureaucracy that attaches to it. How you spin up an acquisition cycle to be able to do what you're talking about, Howard, which is to get ahead of the fact that information and the technology underpinning it changes at a rapid rate of knots these days. And I think it's a challenge that we're looking at quite hard as part of our current structural review of the Ministry of Defence about where we can go to a much more rapid exploitation of technologies. Certainly taking things from what I would call TRL1 level, technical readiness level 1, up to mature level 7, really, really rapid, and bringing it into service. A bit of an answer to it. What we are doing by way of trying to razz up the organisation here is to use the experimentation brigade that we've now got, one brigade, which is purely now focused on experimentation and innovation, as a sort of a test bed, if you like, to bring really good ideas into service a lot quicker. But it's going to take some time. It's going to take politicians and policymakers. They're going to be forced to make some tough choices here about quite often betting on the wrong thing. And betting on the wrong thing quite often until you get to the right thing. And that's not something we've traditionally done.
And I would just add to that the stand-up of Army Futures Command and the integration of our cross-functional teams is one approach, is one step that we're taking in the U.S. Army to recognize that we've got to speed up that process, and we've got to let innovation, let technology drive innovation, let experimentation be driven by scheduled exercises, and let those exercises provide us an opportunity to experiment and modernize iteratively. Because what we often do is we come up with something, we gold plate it and deliver the 100% solution as we develop the requirement and go through endless testing, and then we start to roll it off the assembly line, and by the time the last unit gets it, particularly if it's got hardware and software at its core, like our network and many of our mission command systems, by the time the last unit gets it, technology's already leaped ahead. So we recognize that we'll have multiple versions of some of our mission command platforms at play in our Army at any one time. And by making them more software-centric as opposed to hardware-centric, it'll be just like an iPhone, where we're able to update and keep pace much more easily.
Yeah, so I think what you just witnessed with the WIN-T Increment 2 Bravo decision, which is the tactical satellite comms on the move, where the Army realized it was going to take till 2035 to field 58 brigades, that probably wasn't a great timeline. So I think the Futures Command and CFTs, what Doug is talking about, we will benefit from that in terms of how we do this more expeditionary. But the issue, and it's funny, we're doing just the opposite of what the Brits are doing. As we just knocked out our experimentation brigade, they just built up their experimentation brigade, because we realized that we had to, what Doug just mentioned, we couldn't just rely on these NIEs and AWAs to be the linchpins for testing new kit. What we realized is everything from home station training, he mentioned exercises, to the combat training centers. Where do you plug these technologies in to figure out at a much more rapid rate and to reduce the RDT and E stuff, S&T, down to much more reasonable levels and take off? And I think that we've learned now that we're testing things at much different places at different paces versus a set brigade sitting at Fort Bliss, Texas.
If I could also add, we have different ways of acquiring capability. We've got the very bureaucratic, formal process that is great for armoured vehicles and helicopters and big platforms that you'll have in service for a long time. On top of that, we have spiral development programs where we get an agreed funding line and government approves us to innovate within that set funding line, spiral development. Yep. We're doing that for our soldier combat ensemble. We're taking lessons learned from theatre. We're looking at the latest technologies, and we're spiralling that out to our soldiers on a 2-year cycle. On top of that, and I'm sure it's the same in most militaries, we have quite a sophisticated innovation framework where we get industry to come to us and pitch different products, and I hold a discretionary funding line that I can allocate out to various proposals that show promise. Of course, with all innovation, you want to fail often, you want to fail fast, but you also want to fail cheaply. I would say we've had some success, particularly in digitisation recently. We've got a world-class battle management system. We've got a world-class trunking system that's being developed by Boeing. We've chosen our partners carefully. We can't do it all ourselves, so we are working with them to do that innovation.
Thanks, Kat. Okay, we probably got time for one more. Okay, there you go. Go ahead and stand there. We'll take you. Go ahead.
Lady, gentlemen, thank you very much. Lieutenant Colonel Brian Luty, Army International Affairs. I think interoperability has a great power to enhance our security cooperation that we do with our third country partners. Yes. And it will help overcome some of the challenges that we currently face. But I think there are still going to be some challenges that exist, and wanted to know how you might address those challenges. Namely, I'm talking about like competition for influence with our partners, and then also building trust with our third country partners in terms of us sharing assessments of where their capabilities are, so that we can truly help them build their capabilities. Thank you.
Well, I'll tell you from the guidance from the tower, the issue is to first understand where they think they're coming from. I think, our assessment's one thing, that's great, but what's their assessment? And the question becomes, what's their, again, what are they trying to achieve based on what the priorities are for interoperability? What are they trying to achieve by echelon of integration, like we're talking about here? UK divisions with US cores, to what level are they trying to plug and play? But the issue is for them to be self-aware about what those levels are, and then how we come to a level of agreement. But that's not for us to be in the driver's seat. I'm speaking us as Americans. That's to have that cooperation, common understanding about where they're wanting to go and why, within, again, resources based on how big they are, et cetera.
Yeah, proximity matters. If you're talking about trust between our partners, it's being there on the ground with them, understanding where it is and what levels of operations and where they're going. Yeah, the fight in Mosul, the guys that fought that fight were right there next to their partners all day, every day, all the time. Consequently, they moved forward. Same is true Syria. It's true everywhere, at every level, which is why interoperability as a function has to be dealt with, because we have to be able to show them, hey, this is what's around next corner, and it can't be worried about what your position location is and everything. We have those technical means. We can do it, and that's what our partners are looking for, at least in Iraq and Syria.
That's right. So one thing is when we're talking about at home, when abroad deployed, it's how do you enable?
Correct.
And when you're standing there enabling them, life goes pretty well.
Smoother.
Goes pretty well. You got a quick one, or? No, that's fine. Okay, all right. I want to make sure everybody's the opportunity. Okay. All right. Well, thanks again for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks to my panel mates. And I ask you to allow the panel mates to get up. We have to go to a media engagement, and we're trying to rush to an international luncheon. So please don't stop us between here and the media center. Okay. Thank you.